The blood of Altenburg Barracks.
Private James Carter thought war had hardened him to the worst the world could offer. He'd seen friends torn apart by mortar fire, carried wounded comrades through blood-soaked mud, and stared into the lifeless eyes of the enemy. But the war had never whispered his name. It had never clawed at the edges of his sanity. That changed at Altenburg Barracks. The structure loomed like a dark wound against the snow-covered hills of eastern Germany, its jagged silhouette framed by a sunless sky. The once proud stone walls were scarred by fire, streaked with rust, and pockmarked with the passage of time. As Carter and his unit approached, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. "Smells like blood," muttered Private Will Matheson, his voice low. "Shut up," snapped Sergeant Grady, though his eyes darted nervously at the dilapidated building. "It's just an old barracks. We'll be out of here in a week." Carter glanced at the building, unease prickling at his skin. The windows gaped like empty sockets, and the doorway yawned wide, as if waiting to swallow them whole. The stains inside are dark with age and rot. Inside, the barracks were worse than they'd imagined. The floors were slick with moisture, and the air was thick with decay. Stains spread across the stone like grotesque constellations, some brown with age, others a vivid crimson that looked disturbingly fresh. "Is this blood?" Matheson whispered, pointing to a streak running down the wall. Carter knelt to examine it, dipping his finger into the tacky substance. It was warm. "Let's just get this place set up," he said, wiping his hand on his pants, though his stomach churned. As the soldiers unpacked, strange details began to emerge. Deep gouges marred the wooden beams as though something had clawed at them in a frenzy. The fireplaces were choked with ash and soot, but within the mess, Carter found fragments of bone, small, human. The men joked nervously, trying to shake off the sense of unease, but that night, when the fires burned low, the barracks seemed to come alive. The whispers and blood. Carter woke to the sound of his name. "James!" The voice was soft, barely louder than the creak of the wind through the shattered windows. He sat up, his heart pounding, and saw that Matheson was already awake, his face pale and drawn. "You heard it too?" Matheson whispered. Carter nodded. The room smelled faintly of iron, and when he swung his feet to the floor, his boots squelched in something wet. He lifted his lantern and froze. A dark pool of blood spread across the floor, seeping from the cracks in the stone. It wasn't there when they'd gone to bed. The blood led to the doorway, where it disappeared into the shadows of the hall. "We need to wake the others," Carter said, his voice tight. But as they stepped into the hallway, the air grew colder, the light from the lantern dimming. The walls were slick with fresh blood, dripping down in thick rivulets that pooled at their feet. "James!" The whisper came again, louder now. A figure stood at the end of the hall. It was barely human, its form twisted and broken, its face obscured by a dark veil. Blood dripped from its outstretched hands, pattering onto the stone with sickening rhythm. "Run!" Carter hissed, but Matheson was frozen, his wide eyes locked on the figure. The thing let out a guttural scream and lunged. The descent into madness. By dawn, the barracks were stained with terror. The men spoke of things they couldn't explain. Footsteps in the dark, voices whispering secrets only they knew, and shadows that moved on their own. One soldier, Private Daniels, woke screaming, his hands clawing at his own chest. "They're inside me!" Daniels cried. "I can feel them crawling under my skin!" When they restrained him, they saw the blood. It leaked from his nose, his ears, and the corners of his eyes. Carter tried to calm him, but Daniels only screamed louder, his body convulsing. That night, they found Daniels hanging from a rafter in the main hall, his body swaying gently in the freezing air. His blood had soaked the floor beneath him, forming strange patterns that no one could explain. The men started to break. Private Green refused to leave his cot, muttering about shadows that pressed down on his chest, suffocating him. Corporal Wright claimed he saw faces in the walls, contorted, screaming faces that bled from their mouths and eyes. Carter tried to keep his head, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They followed him everywhere, growing louder, more insistent. "Help us! Join us!" "Bleed." "The basement?" Desperate for answers, Carter and Matheson ventured into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of blood and decay overpowering. Their lantern flickered, casting weak light on the stone stairs, slick with something wet. At the bottom they found the source of the whispers. The room was massive, its walls lined with rusted hooks and chains. Blood covered every surface, some of it fresh, still dripping from the ceiling. In the center of the room stood an altar, carved from black stone and stained with countless sacrifices. Bones littered the floor, human bones. Some were small, like those of children, and others bore deep gouges as though they had been gnawed. As they approached the altar, the whispers turned to screams. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms translucent and bloody. Some were missing limbs, others their eyes. One crawled toward Carter, leaving a trail of blood behind it, its mangled fingers reaching for him. "Run!" Matheson shouted, pulling Carter back. They fled, the screams echoing in their ears. The escape. The remaining soldiers didn't wait for orders. They abandoned the barracks at first light, leaving their gear behind. As they marched away, Carter glanced back. The blood-streaked windows seemed to pulse, as if the building itself were alive. In one of the broken panes he saw a face, a pale eyeless figure watching them leave.